They say the air itself screamed. In the summer of 1462, the Ottoman army, 90,000 strong, marched into Wallachia expecting conquest. What they found was a city ringed not by walls, but by bodies. 20,000 men, women, and soldiers impaled in perfect geometric rows. The smell hit first, then the flies, then the realization. These weren't the dead of battle. They were the message. Rome had its laws. The Ottomans had their cannons. Vlad the Impaler had this. Who could look upon such horror and turn back an empire? The chronicles are silent. The bones are not. If you value the record over legend, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The reports reached Sultan Mehmed II before dawn. His scouts had returned pale and shaking, unable to describe what they'd seen near Targovishte. As the Ottoman army advanced, the smell grew stronger, a thick, sweet rot that clung to armor and cloth. Then the ground opened into a field of wooden stakes, each crowned with a body. They weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged in order, rows, circles, spirals, carefully measured, each stake spaced evenly from the next. Ottoman soldiers, captured in earlier raids, had been impaled alive and left as living monuments to terror. Some corpses had blackened under the sun. Others were still twitching, impaled at angles that missed the heart. A few still breathed when Mehmed arrived. It was said that even the Sultan, who took Constantinople, went silent. Before him stood not a battlefield, but a message. Vlad's handwriting was carved in human flesh. This was not chaos. It was calculation. Vlad had studied fear as if it were an exact science. As a former hostage of the Ottomans, he understood their pride, their military order, their belief that fear belonged only to their enemies. The Forest of the Impaled reversed that logic. He made the empire see its own reflection, disciplined, systematic, merciless, now staring back in death. Ottoman sources claimed 10,000 bodies. Hungarian chronicles said twice that number. The truth lies somewhere in between, but numbers were never the point. This was psychological warfare, a weapon aimed not at the body, but at the mind. Mehmed's officers, men who had survived the sieges of Belgrade and Constantinople, refused to advance. Some accounts say the Sultan turned away and ordered a retreat. Others suggest he merely changed strategy. Either way, the message had worked. The field near Targovishte became known as the Forest of the Dead. No fortress could defend a country like this one did, built not of stone, but of fear. Vlad had turned prisoners into weapons, execution into architecture, death into diplomacy. But to understand how he learned this language, how cruelty became order, we have to go back. Before the stakes, before the throne, to the boy the Ottomans once held captive inside their empire. The story of the forest began in another kind of prison. In 1442, when Vlad was just 11 years old, his father, Vlad II Dracul, ruler of Wallachia, made a deal to keep his throne. The Sultan demanded insurance. His two youngest sons, Vlad and Radu, would be handed over to the Ottoman court as guests. It was the polite word for hostages. They were taken south across the Danube, past the frontier where Wallachia ended and empire began. The palace at Edirne shimmered with wealth. Marble floors, silk banners, perfumed air. But it was also a cage. The brothers were separated, trained, and watched. Guards called them the Dragon's Sons, a reminder that their father's power existed only by Ottoman permission. To the Ottomans, this was not cruelty. It was governance. The empire's brilliance rested on a simple rule: obedience through dependence. By raising the sons of foreign princes inside the court, they manufactured loyalty before conquest. The boys would learn Turkish, Arabic, the Quran, philosophy, mathematics, and war. They would grow to admire their captors, and in time, rule their own countries as Ottoman allies. For Radu, the younger brother, the plan worked. He adapted easily. Ottoman tutors praised his charm, his fluency, his discipline. Records note that he became close to Mehmed, the Sultan's son, future conqueror of Constantinople. Radu was called the Handsome, a name that echoed in palace gossip for years. Vlad was different, defiant, proud, silent. He studied the same lessons, but refused the obedience that came with them. He memorized Arabic prayers, but would not bow. When beaten, he didn't cry out. A chronicler from the court of Edirne later wrote that the boy had the eyes of a hawk and the patience of a serpent. Even at 12, his defiance was noticed. Punishment followed. Some sources speak of chains. Others mention the whip. Ottoman records hint at confinement, perhaps even torture. None are detailed. But all agree that Vlad learned early how fear functioned, not as punishment, but as design. It broke some and hardened others. He decided never to be broken again. While Radu learned diplomacy, Vlad studied the architecture of power. He saw how the Ottomans turned execution into ceremony, how public punishments were staged like theatre, carefully timed, visually deliberate. He saw that terror was not chaos, but order, that an empire could be governed through spectacle as efficiently as through law. These were lessons he would not forget. During those years, Vlad watched the empire's army return from campaigns covered in blood and gold. He listened to officers describe sieges where the corpses of rebels were hung from city gates as warnings. He noticed how the empire always recorded its violence: names, ranks, quantities. Pain was accounted for, tabulated, justified. It was the law of control written in flesh and ink. He also learned another truth, one that would define him. No matter how much the Ottomans taught him, he would never belong. He was the son of a vassal, a reminder of subjugation, valuable but never trusted. The palace taught him Turkish etiquette, but not equality. Every act of education was a reminder of the power that held him. Some modern historians call this the foundation of Vlad's pathology, a mind trained to see cruelty as structure, stripped of belonging, taught that power existed only in domination. By 17, he had absorbed the Ottoman system and inverted it. The empire had created its own enemy. In 1448, after 6 years of captivity, Vlad was released following a political shift. The Ottomans thought they had created a loyal client. Instead, they had built a weapon. He returned to Wallachia to find it gutted by civil war. His father had been betrayed and executed by the boyars, the same nobles who claimed loyalty to the crown but sold it to the highest bidder. His older brother, Mircea, had been buried alive. The Dracul line was broken. Vlad arrived home with no army, no allies, and a single skill: fear. He would use it not as vengeance alone, but as policy. At 17, he briefly seized the throne with Ottoman backing, but his hold was fragile. Within weeks, he was forced into exile in Moldavia. Those lost years became his crucible. He waited, planned, and watched. He studied the politics of small kingdoms that survived between empires, their betrayals, their taxes, their punishments. He learned that a ruler didn't need gold or armies to control men, only reputation. The threat of pain could travel farther than any sword. When he finally returned to power in 1456, he came not as a prince but as a weapon sharpened by humiliation. His reign began with a feast and a test. He invited the same boyars who had killed his father to a banquet in his hall. They arrived dressed in jewels, smiling. Vlad poured them wine, asked them how many princes they had served. Some said 10, others 12. They were proud of their survival. Vlad smiled back. Then he gave the order. The old men were dragged from the hall and impaled outside the palace walls. Their families, the young and the strong, were forced to march north to rebuild the ruined fortress of Poenari by hand. Few survived. To outsiders, it looked like revenge. To Vlad, it was order. He was rebuilding the state through fear, the same fear the Ottomans had once used to rule him. From that moment, Wallachia ceased to be a kingdom of divided loyalties. It became a machine, efficient, brutal, and silent. The hostage had become the engineer, and soon the empire that had taught him terror would taste his version of it. In 1456, Vlad reclaimed the Wallachian throne for the second time. He was 25 years old. To his people, he returned as a prince. To his enemies, he returned as something else. The country he inherited was a ruin. The nobility had turned politics into a trade, selling loyalty to the highest bidder, whether Ottoman or Hungarian. Corruption was law. Merchants cheated soldiers. Tax collectors stole from the treasury. Even the church was divided. In a realm this fractured, brutality wasn't excess. It was structure. Vlad understood this better than anyone. His years as a hostage had taught him what fear could do to a population. Fear could unite. Fear could build. Fear could silence. And now, he would use it to erase weakness itself. His first decree was simple: obedience, absolute, and immediate. The second, justice without mercy. He built courts not for trials, but for sentences. Theft, treason, fraud, all punishable by impalement. The process was slow, deliberate, and public. Unlike the Ottomans, who executed to suppress rebellion, Vlad executed to instruct. Chronicles tell of a merchant who complained that his gold had been stolen while staying in Targoviste. Vlad ordered an investigation. The thief was found, impaled, and the stolen coins returned. But then, to ensure the same thing never happened again, Vlad ordered another test. The next day, he placed a golden cup in the town square, untouched for years after. The message was clear. The price of crime was terror itself. Travelers wrote that one could leave a sack of jewels by the roadside and find it untouched a week later. Fear had accomplished what law could not. But Vlad's reforms went deeper. He restructured the nobility by exterminating it. Those who had survived his coronation feast were used as forced labor to rebuild fortresses and roads. Their families were moved into remote mountain settlements to prevent future alliances. The new administrators were not nobles by birth, but by loyalty. To rule under Vlad was to live under constant surveillance and threat. Still, in those early years, Wallachia thrived. Taxes were collected. Roads were safe. Foreign traders described a land of eerie order, silent markets, honest officials, empty gallows because crime had ceased. It was peace purchased with fear. Yet this peace was not sustainable. Terror, once unleashed, has no limit. And Vlad, once a victim of empire, now became its reflection. In 1459, an Ottoman delegation arrived to collect the annual tribute owed by his father, a routine payment that signified Wallachia's subordination. Vlad greeted the envoys with courtesy. They bowed, but refused to remove their turbans, citing religious custom. It was not defiance, merely protocol. Vlad nodded thoughtfully. "I respect your devotion," he said. "Let me help you honor it forever." He ordered his guards to nail the turbans to their skulls. Not execution, demonstration. The envoys were left alive, sent back to Constantinople to show the Sultan what awaited those who came uninvited. Even by Ottoman standards, this was beyond cruelty. It was theater. Vlad knew the message would spread faster than any letter. Within weeks, it did. The Sultan's court erupted with outrage. Mehmed II, now master of Constantinople, recognized what this meant. His former hostage was not only defiant, he had mastered the empire's own language of power and turned it against its creator. The punishment of the envoys became a declaration of independence. It marked the point where politics ended and psychological war began. That year, Vlad stopped paying tribute entirely. He began raiding Ottoman garrisons along the Danube, burning supply depots, killing soldiers, and impaling their bodies as boundary markers. He didn't hide them. He wanted them found. One Ottoman chronicler recorded that the fields near Giurgiu were filled with men planted like trees, their faces turned toward the river as if to greet their comrades. Vlad's war had no front lines, no formal declarations. It was fought through terror, spectacle, and precision. Every act of violence was a message. Every message a performance of control. European observers, Hungarian, Saxon, Venetian, wrote conflicting accounts. Some called him a barbarian, others a reformer. But they all agreed on one thing. No ruler in Christendom had ever wielded fear so deliberately. Inside Wallachia, he was called Csepesh, the Impaler. The name stuck, not as insult, but as definition. He had become the instrument he once feared. And while Europe debated his morality, the Ottomans began to prepare for war. In Constantinople, Mehmed's advisors urged swift retaliation, but the Sultan hesitated. He had seen what Vlad was capable of. The hostage boy had become a strategist, whose weapon was not the sword, but the human imagination. Mehmed finally decided to act. In early 1462, he assembled an army larger than any that had marched into the Balkans before. Perhaps 90,000 men, 20,000 cavalry, thousands of janissaries. It would not be an invasion, it would be an erasure. But Vlad was waiting. And the empire that taught him fear was about to meet its own reflection, magnified, inverted, and sharpened into nightmare. By 1460, Vlad ruled a country that no longer breathed without his permission. Order had returned, but it was the kind of order that came from silence. No theft, no rebellion, no dissent, because punishment was not rumor anymore. It had shape, rhythm, and law. The impalement, his signature punishment, was not improvisation. It was design. Vlad didn't invent the stake. He perfected it. In Ottoman lands, impalement was used rarely as a warning. Vlad turned it into a system. To him, death was not enough. Pain had to be seen, organized, and well recorded. Contemporary chronicles describe how his executioners were trained to work with surgical precision. The stakes were rounded, not sharpened, polished smooth, and oiled to prevent a quick death. The point was inserted through the rectum or abdomen, angled to miss vital organs, emerging through the chest, shoulder, or mouth. The body was then raised vertically. Gravity did the rest. The process could take hours, sometimes days. Victims didn't die screaming. They died choking on their own blood, long after their voices failed. It wasn't chaos. It was administration. Every stake had a purpose. Peasants were impaled low to the ground, nobles higher. Foreign captives were placed at the borders, criminals along the main roads. Punishment was geography. The map of Wallachia itself became a visual index of obedience. A Saxon chronicler wrote that no man could travel 10 miles without seeing the prince's law displayed in flesh. That was the point. To his followers, Vlad's cruelty was justice in visible form. To his enemies, it was madness. But even madness, when it works, becomes policy. And it worked. Theft vanished. Corruption disappeared. Nobles who plotted rebellion were found hanging from stakes outside their own estates. There was a story, perhaps true, perhaps legend, of a noble who dined with Vlad and hesitated to complain about the smell of rotting corpses drifting from the city gates. Vlad noticed and smiled. "If it offends you," he said, "we can move you higher, where the air is cleaner." The man stayed silent. Fear had replaced loyalty, but it functioned. The roads were safe, the treasury full, and merchants from Saxony and Venice wrote with awe of a land where discipline bordered on the supernatural. Yet, behind that order was a ruler watching everything. He had turned execution into infrastructure. The stakes became his bureaucracy, his diplomacy, his gospel. To the Ottomans, these acts were barbaric. To Vlad, they were translation, the only language he believed empires understood. But impalement wasn't his only instrument. There were smaller rituals too, designed to measure obedience. He required foreign visitors to remove their hats in his court, the same custom he had once twisted into punishment. He inspected soldiers personally, ordered servants flogged for sloppy uniforms, and had officials executed for errors in paperwork. Every action had meaning, every punishment a point. He wasn't killing for pleasure. He was teaching a lesson that no one would forget. In Wallachia, fear was the law, but no lesson lasts forever. By 1461, the Ottoman envoys nailed alive had done their work. Constantinople was no longer debating, it was preparing. Mehmed II had faced rebellions before, but this one was different. The Sultan had conquered cities. Vlad conquered perception. His acts spread like infection. The stories of stakes, of golden cups untouched, of merchants impaled for lies. They crossed borders faster than armies. In Saxon towns along the Danube, pamphlets appeared, woodcuts of forests of bodies, their faces contorted in agony, and a thin figure seated among them, Vlad dining calmly. Some were exaggerations, others based on reports from travelers and merchants. Together they formed something new, mass propaganda. Vlad had terrified his own people into silence. Now his enemies used his image to terrify Europe. And yet, the stories made him famous. To some, he was a saint of order, a Christian prince defending Europe from the Turks by any means necessary. To others, a monster draped in righteousness. Both were true, because Vlad had understood something no one else had. Terror doesn't need to be moral to be effective. It just needs to be believed. As 1462 approached, the Danube froze under winter. The Sultan gathered his generals. The time for negotiation had passed. An army of 90,000 men, janissaries, cavalry, engineers, and siege cannons would march north into Wallachia. Their mission was simple: to erase the man who had turned fear into government. But Vlad was already moving. While the empire prepared its invasion, he prepared its nightmare. In the spring of 1462, the river thawed and the war began. The Ottoman army, nearly 90,000 men, crossed the Danube under the banners of Sultan Mehmed II. This was not an invasion, it was a purge. The Sultan's goal was not conquest, but eradication. He had burned cities before, he had leveled empires. But this time, his enemy was not a state. It was a single man who ruled by terror. Vlad had no illusions. His army numbered perhaps 30,000, mostly peasants, few trained soldiers, fewer weapons. A direct battle was suicide. But he had spent his life studying how fear worked on the mind. So instead of fortifying cities, he emptied them. Villages were abandoned, fields burned, wells poisoned. The Ottomans advanced into a void. No food, no water, no resistance. At night, they began to hear screams. Small raiding parties, 50, sometimes 100 men, struck the edges of the Ottoman camps. They killed sentries, burned tents, and vanished into the forest before dawn. The next night, it happened again. The night after, somewhere else. These weren't battles, they were messages. Every torch, every corpse, every echo of laughter carried one phrase: "You are being watched." Mehmed's commanders tried to impose order. They doubled the guards, enforced curfews, forbade fires after dark. But fear has its own logic. Soldiers began to see movement where there was none. Horses panicked at shadows. Officers reported voices whispering in the trees. The Sultan had conquered Constantinople, but he had never fought a war like this, one where the enemy was not an army, but an idea. Vlad called it the Night War. He knew that terror magnified itself in darkness. His men used captured Ottoman uniforms, spoke Turkish, and moved silently through the marshes. They killed messengers, spread false rumors, and forged letters suggesting mutiny in the Ottoman ranks. And then came the masterpiece, June 17th, 1462, near Targovishte. That night, the moon vanished behind clouds. Vlad led 10,000 men in what would become one of the most infamous ambushes in medieval history, the night attack. Disguised in Ottoman uniforms, his troops infiltrated the camp itself. The signal was a trumpet blast at midnight. Chaos followed. Tents burned, horses screamed, Vlad's men shouted in Turkish, "The Sultan is dead." The Janissaries panicked, attacking their own comrades in confusion. For hours, fire devoured the camp. Vlad's objective was singular: to reach the Sultan's pavilion and kill him. According to several eyewitness accounts, Vlad and Mehmed came within sight of each other across the smoke. The Sultan's guards held the line just long enough for him to escape. When dawn broke, the Ottomans counted over 2,000 dead. Vlad's forces withdrew intact. It was not a military victory. It was a psychological detonation. Mehmed realized that his enemy had weaponized everything the empire stood for: discipline, fear, obedience, and turned it inward. He saw his army crumble, not because of loss, but because of terror. And then, the most terrible act of all. When Mehmed regrouped and marched deeper into Wallachia, he found the road leading to Targovishte lined with stakes. At first, a few hundred, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Ottoman chroniclers claim the forest stretched for 2 miles. Wallachian records say 20,000 bodies. Every victim was placed with precision: soldiers, captives, even civilians. The dead had been organized. One stake rose above all others. On it hung the body of Hamza Pasha, an Ottoman commander captured weeks earlier, still wearing his armor, posed as if saluting his sultan. Witnesses said the smell could be felt before it was seen. Men vomited, horses reared. Some soldiers refused to march forward. Mehmed, who had broken the walls of Constantinople, stopped his horse and stared in silence. Chroniclers record his words: "It is not possible to deprive of his land a man who does such great things." It was not praise, it was recognition. He understood that he was facing something the empire could not fight. A ruler who used horror as architecture, whose defense was not walls, but the imagination of his enemies. After days of debate, Mehmed turned his army back. The empire retreated, not from defeat, but from vision. The message had been delivered. No envoy, no letter, no words, just the geometry of death. And as the Ottoman army withdrew across the Danube, the air behind them carried the smell of what they had seen. That odor, the proof of terror, was Vlad's real weapon. But victory came with a price. Because once fear becomes your law, you cannot stop enforcing it. And when the enemy is gone, only your own people remain to fear you. The Ottomans had turned back. The empire that had conquered Constantinople had been stopped, not by armies or walls, but by the image of death. In the eyes of Europe, Vlad became a savior, a prince who had stood alone against Islam, a shield of Christendom. The Pope sent letters of praise. Hungarian nobles toasted his name. Merchants whispered about the forest of the impaled with both disgust and reverence. But at home, the celebration ended quickly, because terror, once unleashed, doesn't fade, it feeds. Vlad had built his power on fear, and fear demands maintenance. With the Ottomans gone, the stakes that once pointed outward began to turn inward. In late 1462, Wallachia entered a season of paranoia. Vlad saw betrayal everywhere. Merchants accused of cheating in trade were impaled. Peasants who failed to deliver grain were accused of theft and executed. Couriers who arrived late were beaten or killed. One story, recorded by a Saxon chronicler, describes a messenger who lost his temper during an audience and covered his nose because of the stench of corpses. Vlad, noticing, had him impaled higher than the others, so the air might be cleaner. He called it justice. Others called it madness. But in Vlad's mind, there was no difference. His obsession with order deepened. Every crime became treason, every mistake a moral failure. He introduced strict regulations for trade and taxation, enforced not by law, but by terror. Officials who miscounted coins or underreported tax collections were executed publicly, their ledgers hung around their necks. Foreign envoys began to fear invitations to his court. In one incident, a group of Saxon traders who disputed tariffs were arrested. Vlad ordered half of them impaled outside their warehouses and forced the rest to watch before releasing them to tell the story. And yet, trade continued. Commerce flourished. Roads remained safe, because the same fear that killed rebellion also protected routine. It was the same principle he had learned as a boy in Adern. Terror works because it is predictable. It creates a world where safety exists only under the ruler's will. But fear has no balance. Every act of control requires another to sustain it. And soon, even Vlad's allies began to break away. The Saxon merchants of Transylvania, his economic lifeline, turned against him. They published pamphlets across the Holy Roman Empire, the blood drinker of Wallachia. These weren't stories of heroism. They were accusations. The pamphlets described him as a demon in human form, feasting among corpses, boiling people alive, nailing hats to heads. Some accounts were true, others exaggerated. But the image stuck. For the first time, the same mechanism that had made Vlad feared now made him vulnerable. Fear spread both ways. Meanwhile, Mehmed II wasn't done. After retreating, he left behind a political weapon. Radu the Handsome, Vlad's younger brother, the Sultan's protege. Radu was everything Vlad was not: charming, diplomatic, calm. Ottoman gold flowed into his hands. With it, he began to buy loyalty inside Wallachia. Nobles who had survived Vlad's purges saw an opportunity. They didn't need to fight. They only needed to wait. Inside the court, rumors spread. The Sultan would back Radu as the legitimate ruler. Hungarian envoys hesitated to send aid. The same European powers that had praised Vlad began to turn away. By winter 1462, his isolation was complete. The same methods that had driven out the empire had hollowed his own. He executed advisors for imagined treason. He burned villages that refused taxes. Even his soldiers, exhausted from years of night raids and impalements, began to desert. The law of terror was consuming its author. Vlad still believed he was enforcing justice, purging corruption, defending faith, protecting his people from Ottoman infiltration. But the line between justice and paranoia had vanished. He no longer ruled through fear, he ruled for it. In November 1462, his forces clashed with Radu's at the border of Transylvania. Many of his men defected before the battle began. The Ottomans supplied Radu with money, weapons, and credibility. By the year's end, Wallachia was collapsing into famine and chaos. The man who had terrified an empire was now being undone by his own reflection. Radu entered Wallachia with little resistance, declaring himself prince under Ottoman protection. Vlad fled north toward Hungary, seeking aid from his supposed ally, King Matthias Corvinus. He carried with him letters proving his loyalty to the Christian cause, expecting refuge. Instead, he was shown forged documents, letters that appeared to prove he had been negotiating secretly with the Ottomans. They were fakes, almost certainly produced by the Saxons, who now sought his destruction. But Matthias didn't care. Vlad had become politically inconvenient. In December 1462, Vlad the Impaler was arrested in Buda and imprisoned. The cell door closed. The engineer of fear had been placed inside his own system. It was a quiet end for the man who had turned pain into law. No forest of bodies, no war drums, just the echo of chains. But terror, once perfected, never really dies. It waits for a new throne, a new cause, a new believer. And while Vlad sat in silence, Europe began to write. The stories would outlive him. For 12 years, the man who terrified an empire lived behind stone walls. Vlad the Impaler, once a prince surrounded by executions, now a captive in a foreign court, was kept under honorable detention by King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. To the outside world, it was politics. To Vlad, it was an irony so perfect it bordered on divine punishment. He had built his rule on imprisonment through fear. Now, he was the prisoner. But captivity didn't break him. According to court records, Vlad was not thrown into a dungeon. He lived in a guarded estate near Buda, later in Visegrad, under restricted freedom. He ate well, received visitors, even married. His wife was a cousin of Matthias. He attended church. He seemed reformed, but the stories that leaked from servants told otherwise. In private, Vlad kept insects in jars and impaled them on sticks. He slaughtered small animals, dissecting them to study how they died. He questioned guards about execution methods used in other lands. When asked why he did it, he allegedly replied, "To remember." Time turned his legend into a weapon for others. In Transylvania and Germany, pamphlets continued to circulate. Woodcuts of impalements, boiling cauldrons, decapitations. They were printed not to document, but to sell. Vlad's image became Europe's first mass-market horror story. He could not control the narrative anymore. Fear, the tool he once mastered, now existed independently, spreading across borders, interpreted by merchants, priests, enemies. He had become what he once engineered, an idea. By 1474, the Ottoman frontier was shifting again. The Sultan's armies pressed north toward Moldavia, threatening Hungary's borders. Suddenly, Matthias needed the monster back. Better a brutal ally than no ally at all. So, Vlad was released. He emerged from prison older, thinner, more controlled, but not softer. Witnesses described a man who spoke rarely, whose gaze never left people's faces, as if measuring how much fear they could feel. He promised the king loyalty and Christianity. He swore to defend Europe from the Turks. But those who met him sensed something unchanged beneath the calm. An unbroken conviction that terror was not evil if it worked. In November 1476, with Hungarian and Moldavian support, Vlad reclaimed his throne for the third time. Wallachia, torn by famine and rebellion, accepted him reluctantly. The same nobles who once deserted him now pledged allegiance out of necessity. They remembered what happened to those who didn't. His rule this time lasted only weeks. The Ottomans, advancing north, sent a large detachment led by Basarab Laiota, an ally of Radu. In December, their forces clashed near Bucharest. The battle was chaotic, short, and final. Vlad was killed, perhaps by his own men, perhaps by Ottoman soldiers. Accounts differ, but all agree on what came next. His head was cut off, preserved in honey, and sent to Constantinople as proof. The Sultan had it displayed on a stake before the city gates. The man who had built a forest of bodies was now part of one. His body's fate remains uncertain. Chronicles claim it was buried at Snagov Monastery, north of Bucharest. Excavations centuries later found a tomb, but it was empty. Even in death, Vlad refused to stay still. What remained was the image. A man who turned horror into law. A ruler who proved that fear could conquer empires but never sustain peace. A prisoner who outlived his captors in legend. Within a generation, stories about Vlad spread across Europe in dozens of languages. In Germany, he was called Dracula Wade, the dragon's son. In Russia, Volos Draculia. By the 15th century's end, he was no longer a historical prince. He was myth. And myths are harder to kill than men, because in every tale there is a reflection of something deeper. Vlad was not born a monster. He was educated into one. He learned from empires that domination was order, that obedience was virtue, that terror was civilization's hidden spine. He simply believed them more completely than they did. When he impaled prisoners, when he nailed turbans to skulls, when he burned villages for disobedience, he wasn't breaking the rules of empire. He was applying them. And that's the truth that Europe could never face. So they turned him into a legend instead. The prince became the monster. The policy became the myth. And through that myth, power hid its reflection. When Vlad died, the world should have forgotten him. He was a minor prince in a borderland no empire wanted to govern for long, a footnote in the wars between Hungary and the Ottomans. But fear doesn't die with its author, it reproduces. In the decades that followed, his story began to move, copied, rewritten, reinterpreted across Europe's printing presses. In Germany, pamphlets titled Geschichte des grausamen Voivoden Dracula, the story of the cruel Prince Dracula, were sold in market squares for a few copper coins. The woodcuts showed forests of impaled men, boiling cauldrons, severed limbs. Some even depicted Vlad seated calmly at a table, dining among the dying. These were not histories. They were moral mirrors. Each story exaggerated the last, shifting him from a tyrant into a demon, a cautionary symbol for every petty ruler and ambitious prince. But to Eastern Europe, he remained something else entirely. In Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania, the people who had suffered his terror remembered him not as a monster, but as a restorer of order. They told stories of roads so safe a golden coin could lie untouched for days, of judges too afraid to take bribes, of merchants who prayed for Dracula's law when thieves multiplied. It was the paradox of fear. The same cruelty that destroyed lives had preserved a fragile sense of justice. To some, he was a saint of severity, proof that peace required blood. By the 16th century, two Vlads existed in the West: the Impaler, the cannibal, the heretic. In the East, the savior tyrant who punished evil when no one else would. The contradiction made him immortal. As Europe slid toward religious wars, pamphleteers revived his image again, this time as a metaphor for moral decay. The Protestants used him to condemn Catholic cruelty, Catholics to condemn heresy. In every version, Vlad fit perfectly. He was a reflection, not a figure. A century after his death, he had become what every tyrant dreams of becoming: a symbol that outlives accountability. The bones were gone. The horror had become language. By 1600, the story of Vlad the Impaler had fused with older local legends, of cursed nobles who drank blood, of spirits who rose at night. The word Dracul, once meaning the dragon, slowly twisted into Dracula, the son of the devil. Somewhere between translation and memory, the prince dissolved, leaving behind a myth powerful enough to survive the Enlightenment, colonization, and the birth of print capitalism. He no longer belonged to history. He belonged to psychology. Every generation found a new use for him. Renaissance scholars cited him as proof of barbaric East. Romantic poets called him the Black Heart of Europe. Folklorists turned him into a ghost. But in all retellings, one truth remained. The fear he created was always rational. It wasn't the madness of one man. It was the reflection of systems, of empire, law, and religion that required cruelty to function. And that's why Vlad still haunted the European conscience long after the stakes rotted and the forests grew back. Because he had revealed the machinery of civilization itself, stripped of its illusions, lit by torchlight, covered in flies. In that image of order built on terror, every empire recognized a part of itself. And that is why they could never truly condemn him. They needed him. Fear had always been the foundation of rule. Vlad had only made it visible. 3 centuries after Vlad's death, the stakes had long turned to dust, but the fear lived on, dormant in folklore. In the villages of Transylvania, peasants whispered about Strigoi, the restless dead who rose from their graves to drink blood. They spoke of nobles cursed for cruelty, of unburied corpses seen walking at night. To them, these weren't metaphors. They were memories, distorted echoes of real violence turned into superstition. Europe was changing. The Enlightenment had promised reason. Industrial progress had promised control. Yet, beneath that veneer of science, something old and primitive kept stirring: the fascination with terror. By the 18th century, Western scholars began to collect the folklore of the Balkans. The word vampire entered German, then French, then English. It was always described as a creature of foreign lands, a superstition from the barbaric East. Few realized that behind it lay the memory of a historical man. In 1816, a British diplomat in Bucharest named William Wilkinson published an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. Buried in the pages was a brief note about a prince named Dracula, notorious for cruelty but revered by his people. That obscure reference would later find its way into the hands of an Irish novelist, Bram Stoker. Stoker never visited Transylvania. He pieced together his story from maps, travelers' accounts, and folklore books, especially Wilkinson's mention of Dracula. He didn't know it referred to Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, but the name struck him. It sounded ancient, regal, and damned. In Stoker's notes, Dracula replaced his original working title, Count Wampire. By 1897, the legend was reborn. The novel Dracula was not a history, it was a confession. It took the architecture of empire and turned it into horror. The Count was an aristocrat who drank blood to sustain power, moved across borders, spoke many languages, and conquered nations not through armies, but through infection. In other words, he was Europe itself. Readers were fascinated. The monster was alluring, intelligent, disciplined, a mirror held up to colonial ambition and moral decay. For centuries, Europe had projected barbarism onto the East. Now the East had sent a figure back, a reflection in the form of a vampire. And through fiction, the fear that once belonged to a real Wallachian prince became the defining myth of the modern world. But the irony was cruel. The real Vlad had died defending Christendom from Ottoman expansion. The fictional Dracula now embodied the very evil he once claimed to resist. The name that once terrified empires had become entertainment. The instrument of terror had turned into spectacle. Yet the transformation wasn't random. It was convenient. By turning a ruler of historical cruelty into a supernatural creature, Europe had accomplished what all power structures eventually do. It displaced its guilt onto myth. The Impaler was no longer a product of empire. He was a curse. And curses don't ask questions. The legend of Dracula spread faster than any history could follow, translated into dozens of languages, adapted for stage, film, and pulp. The monster became immortal because he served a purpose. He kept the truth buried, because the truth was never about blood-sucking. It was about control, the way fear circulates through society, how rulers feed on obedience, and how empires feed on their colonies. Vlad the Impaler had shown it with stakes. Bram Stoker showed it with symbols. Different centuries, same story. When the Count sank his teeth into London, it wasn't Wallachia invading the West. It was Europe consuming itself. By the dawn of the 20th century, Dracula had escaped the page. He was no longer a story about Vlad, or Transylvania, or even fear. He was a product, absorbed, marketed, exported. Hollywood stripped him of his history and dressed him in velvet. The first film adaptation, Nosferatu, 1922, turned him into a shadow, skeletal, silent, alien. Germany was collapsing after war and inflation, and the monster became an allegory for something unspoken, the decay of empire. When Universal Studios remade him in 1931, the Count wore a tuxedo and spoke with aristocratic charm. The fear had evolved. It wasn't about torture anymore. It was about class. Vlad the Impaler, the prince who used horror to control peasants, was reborn as the symbol of the upper class consuming the poor. The fangs replaced the stake, but the meaning remained. Power still feeds on blood. Each generation adapted the myth to its anxieties. In the 1950s, Hammer Films turned him into erotic horror, reflecting the repression of post-war society. In the 1980s, he became a metaphor for disease. AIDS as vampirism, fear as infection. By the 21st century, he was a love story. The monster was now misunderstood, romantic, even tragic. The cruelty had been rebranded as loneliness. Every retelling moved further from history, yet closer to psychology. Because Dracula never belonged to one era. He was the personification of something timeless, the human need to justify domination. Empires change uniforms. Power changes names. But its method, fear, remains constant. Vlad had used stakes. Modern systems use prisons, propaganda, algorithms. Different instruments, same logic. Control through spectacle. What history calls civilization is often just the evolution of how we organize pain. And Vlad Tepes was one of its purest engineers. It's easy to point at the vampire and say, monster. It's harder to admit that the real horror is the system that keeps needing monsters to explain itself. The legend of Dracula survives not because we love fear, but because it gives fear form, something to name, to dress, to sell. It allows society to keep committing violence while pretending it's fiction. Every empire has its Dracula. The Romans called it law. The Ottomans called it order. The modern world calls it security. Different words, same ritual. Sacrifice the few to reassure the many. And the bones, as always, remain beneath the floorboards. The real Vlad never drank blood. He only mastered a truth we still live by, that the sight of pain, properly staged, holds nations together better than faith or gold. That is why his myth never dies. Because the mechanism he built never did. If you peel back the legend, past the fangs, past the castle, past the candlelight, you don't find a vampire. You find paperwork, ledgers, laws written in the language of punishment. And that's when you realize the story of Vlad the Impaler was never about the darkness of one man. It was about how easily darkness becomes policy. The legend of Vlad the Impaler has lasted 6 centuries because it satisfies a truth no civilization wants to admit: cruelty works. Every empire that condemned him quietly copied him. Rome crucified for order. The church tortured for faith. Modern states bomb for peace. Each calls its violence by a different name, but the structure is the same. Spectacle, obedience, silence. Vlad's genius was not inventing cruelty. It was stripping away its excuses. He didn't pretend his killings were holy. He didn't call them reform or liberation. He called them rule. That's why history could never forgive him. Not for the blood, but for the honesty. The chronicles tried to bury him under moral language. Madman, demon, tyrant. But the bones tell a simpler story. He understood the economy of fear before modern politics did. Terror was efficient. It required no bureaucracy, no persuasion, only witnesses. Pain, when organized, was communication. What he built in Wallachia was not a kingdom. It was a prototype, a social machine that used trauma as glue. And though the methods changed, the formula endures. In the 20th century, governments learned to industrialize fear. Cameras replaced spikes. Censorship replaced the stake. The message remained identical. You are being watched. Disobey and vanish. The Impaler's forest of bodies has become a forest of data. The geometry of terror has migrated from fields of corpses to networks of screens. If Vlad's world was ruled by spectacle, ours is ruled by surveillance. An evolution, not a departure. One inspired fear through sight, the other through the awareness of being seen. And yet, we call our age humane. but ask the refugees driven from war zones called liberation. Ask the dissidents silenced in the name of security. Ask the workers punished in systems that worship efficiency but never mercy. They would recognize the pattern instantly. The real continuity between the stake and the algorithm isn't technology, it's philosophy. The belief that order is worth any cost, if others are the ones who pay it. When Vlad built his forest, he didn't just defend a border, he demonstrated a principle, that a nation's stability can rest on terror if the spectacle is convincing enough. Empires since have done nothing but prove him right. This is why the myth of Dracula thrives in every age. He is not just horror, he is memory. An uncomfortably accurate reflection of how civilizations justify themselves. Every time we label cruelty as necessity, every time we mistake control for safety, the count rises again. Not from the grave Morbov, but from policy documents. Dracula isn't undead. He's institutional. That's why the myth survives every moral revolution, every empire's collapse, every attempt to sanitize history. He persists because power still needs him. He reminds rulers that fear works, and reminds the ruled that obedience feels safer than defiance. The 15th century forest of impaled bodies and the 21st century prison walls are built from the same material: compliance. Vlad just made it visible. And maybe that's why his legend will outlive all others. Because as long as we organize the world through fear, his story remains prophecy. History remembers Vlad the Impaler as a monster. But monsters are never born in isolation. They are bred by systems that require them, raised by law, sanctified by order, and forgotten when their work is done. Vlad didn't invent cruelty. He perfected it because he understood what his world truly valued: stability over justice, spectacle over truth, and obedience over conscience. He just stripped civilization of its costume and showed it, the naked shape of power. That's why his story endures. Not because of blood, or fangs, or castles, but because of what it exposes. That fear, once written into the logic of governance, never leaves. It only evolves. Every generation resurrects its own version of Vlad. We just call them by different names: protector, reformer, liberator. They build new kinds of stakes: bureaucratic, digital, financial, and tell us it's for our safety. And we believe them because we've always believed the same story: that peace must be bought with someone else's pain. The chronicles may be silent, but the bones are not. Excavations in Transylvania still find human remains pierced through the pelvis, angled to prolong death. Forensic analysis shows deliberate precision, geometry used as punishment. The same precision that defines modern systems of control. The same belief that suffering can be measured, justified, and forgotten. That's the real horror. Not that Vlad existed, but that he made sense. The myth of Dracula was never an escape from history. It was history disguising itself as myth, whispering that civilization is always one policy away from barbarism. In the end, Vlad's life is a mirror with no comfort in it. He turned fear into law, pain into performance, death into message, and he won. He defeated empires, rewrote power, became immortal through the very act meant to erase him. But his triumph carries a warning. Fear may build order, but it cannot sustain it. Every regime built on terror eventually becomes terrified of itself. Every impaler becomes the impaled. The forest he built was not a landscape of corpses. It was a prophecy. A vision of what happens when power mistakes obedience for loyalty and violence for virtue. And if that prophecy still feels relevant, it's because the system he revealed never ended. We still live inside its architecture, less visible, more polite, infinitely more efficient. The stakes are now invisible, the punishments digital, the screams replaced by silence, but the logic remains, and the bones still speak. When the ledger closes, the total is always the same: pain in, order out. If you value the record over the legend, remember this: Vlad the Impaler did not show us evil, he showed us ourselves.